My name is Jessica, and I'm 30 years old. My husband Ryan is currently deployed overseas, leaving me alone in our apartment here in Chicago. I never imagined that being without him would be this tough. We've always been a strong couple, leaning on each other through thick and thin, but now life has taken a different turn, and I have to navigate it on my own. My younger brother by adoption, Dylan, who's 24, recently moved in with me for his internship in the city. Over the years, we haven't been particularly close, but I was happy he was coming. However, things didn't unfold as smoothly as I had hoped. When Ryan was deployed, I thought I could manage the solitude. We knew this day would come, and we tried to prepare ourselves for the separation, or at least I thought I was ready. In the beginning, I kept myself occupied with work and everyday routines. But as the weeks went by and Ryan's letters became less frequent, the reality of my loneliness truly began to sink in. Life without him felt surreal. The apartment that once echoed with laughter and conversation now felt vast and hollow. Even the constant hum of the city outside my window offered little solace. It was as if a piece of my life had been taken away with him, leaving me feeling abandoned in a world that no longer seemed familiar. Evenings stretched on endlessly, and I found myself sitting in silence, lost in thought. When Dylan offered to stay with me during his internship, I was relieved at the prospect. We hadn't been particularly close since he became my adopted brother, but I remembered him as a quiet and shy boy. Maybe having him around would help fill the void. But when he arrived, I was taken aback. Dylan had changed. He was no longer the reserved boy I remembered, but had grown into a confident and striking young man. The way he carried himself, the intensity in his gaze, it all made me feel uneasy. I knew I shouldn't be thinking this way, but I found myself seeing him as a man rather than as my brother. These thoughts unsettled me deeply. I couldn't comprehend why my mind was suddenly filled with these confusing feelings. I tried to tell myself it was just the loneliness playing tricks on me, but each day the cloud in my mind seemed to grow thicker. The emptiness and loneliness I felt without Ryan were slowly being replaced with something else entirely, and it frightened me. It became especially difficult to keep my composure when Dylan would emerge from the shower, wrapped in nothing but a towel. Each time I saw his wet hair and the droplets of water tracing paths down his body, I found myself breathless. Or when he'd prepare breakfast in the kitchen, wearing only his boxers. I tried not to look, but my thoughts constantly circled back to how much he had matured. Chicago was in the grip of summer, with the air heavy and the humidity offering no reprieve. One day, Dylan mentioned that the air conditioner in his room had given out. I tried to find someone to fix it, but everyone was booked, so I suggested he sleep in my room where the air conditioner was still functioning. Dylan hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. After all, we were family, so what could go wrong? However, when he stepped into my bedroom that first night, the situation felt far more awkward than I had anticipated. I was already in bed, wearing a sheer nightgown, when Dylan walked in. He couldn't help but notice my figure beneath the thin fabric. His gaze lingered a bit too long, and the tension in the room grew thick. My heart started racing and my mouth went dry. I wanted to say something to ease the tension, but the words just wouldn't come. Jake sat down on the edge of the bed, and I tried to steer our conversation towards something neutral, anything to distract from the tension that seemed to hang between us. But every glance, every small gesture from him made me feel like there was more between us than just the bond of siblings. I kept reminding myself that we shouldn't feel this way, but with every passing minute, it was becoming harder to convince myself otherwise. Our conversations were growing deeper, more open with each day. We started talking about things we had never discussed before, our fears, disappointments, and even our desires. Sometimes our talks would stretch late into the night, and I couldn't help but notice the way he looked at me. That look, it wasn't the way a brother should look at his sister. I tried to conceal my feelings, but each day it became more challenging. His presence, the way he moved, the way his hand brushed against even the smallest things, it all stirred something deep within me. I found myself reacting to the simplest things like his smile or a casual touch with waves of emotion that I couldn't easily dismiss. The pull between us grew stronger, but neither of us dared to make the first move. Each evening we spent together in the same room only increased the tension. Our late night conversations would go on for hours, with neither of us wanting the night to end. When we eventually ran out of things to say, the silence that settled between us was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the tension fill in the space, knowing we were inching closer to a dangerous line. But I couldn't bring myself to stop. There were moments when Jake would look at me with an expression that was anything but brotherly. I felt emotions welling up inside me, ones I tried desperately to suppress. I kept telling myself this was wrong, that I had to keep my distance, but each day it grew more difficult. Then, one particularly hot and stifling night, something shifted between us. We were both lying there in the darkness, and I could hear Jake's breathing, uneven and fast. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't calm the whirlwind of thoughts swirling around his nearness. It felt as though something was inevitable. I turned towards him, our eyes locking in the dim light, and without exchanging a single word, our faces slowly began to draw closer. I don't remember who initiated it. It was a moment charged with passion and pent-up emotions. Our lips met, and everything inside me turned upside down. This wasn't just a kiss, it was the release of all the feelings we had been struggling to contain. It was gentle, yet filled with an undeniable desire. When the kiss ended, I quickly pulled away, the weight of what we had just done crashing down on me. I had crossed a line I swore I'd never cross. I wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words were stuck in my throat. A wave of guilt washed over me, overwhelming and heavy. How could I have let this happen? But despite the guilt, I couldn't ignore the truth. My feelings for Jake had only grown stronger. That kiss had confirmed everything I had been denying for so long. As the tension between us reached its breaking point, everything that followed felt inevitable. Jake was so close, and I could feel his warmth, his breath mingling with mine. Every touch, even the lightest brush of his fingers, sent a surge of emotions through me that I could no longer ignore. I turned toward him without saying a word. Our eyes met, and in that instant, everything became clear. Jake slowly raised his hand, his fingers gently grazing my skin. That touch, so soft at first, almost like a whisper, awakened feelings within me that I had been desperately trying to push down. His hand slowly trailed down my back, and I felt my breath catch. His fingers lingered as if he too was trying to grasp what was happening between us. The moment was filled with tenderness, yet it was charged with so much anticipation. Jake, as if summoning all his courage, moved closer, and the distance between us vanished. I felt his touch, his warmth, his careful movements, so gentle as if he feared disturbing the fragile balance between us. But the moment our bodies finally came together, everything else faded away. His arms wrapped around me, and I allowed myself to be close to him, letting go of the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. It was as if the entire world had paused, leaving just the two of us in that room. I could feel each breath he took, every subtle movement, and my own emotions began to overwhelm me. All the restraint, all the rules we had tried to follow, crumbled under the weight of this moment. When it was over, I lay beside him, my heart pounding so loudly that it felt like he could hear it too. The silence in the room was almost suffocating, yet it felt like so much had been communicated without a single word. I knew that what had just happened had changed something between us. Jake was the first to break the silence. He looked at me with a hint of uncertainty in his eyes and said, "You were my first." I froze for a moment, trying to process what he had just revealed. I I didn't know," I whispered, feeling a confusing mix of embarrassment and unexpected realization rising in my chest. He gave me a small smile, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. "And I don't regret it," he added. I tried to lighten the mood with a joke, saying, "Well, I guess that makes me your teacher now. Older sisters are supposed to teach their younger brothers." But the joke fell flat, doing nothing to ease the tension I felt inside. I knew that something much deeper had occurred between us, and it unsettled me. Ryan's return was a shock. I received a message from his commander, informing me that he would be coming home earlier than expected due to a serious injury. As I read those words, a knot tightened in my stomach. Memories of what had happened with Jake, of the line we had crossed, came rushing back with full force. and I felt guilt wrapping itself around me like a vice. When Ryan finally arrived home, I could hardly recognize him. His face was drawn, his shoulder heavily bandaged, and he looked utterly exhausted and worn down. The confidence that once lit up his eyes had dimmed. I rushed to him, trying to act thrilled at his return, but my heart was weighed down with guilt. "How are you?" I asked, doing my best to hide the inner turmoil that was tearing me apart. I knew he needed my care and support now more than ever, but the thought of Jake and what we had done gnawed at my conscience. "I'll get through it," Ryan replied, nodding toward his injured shoulder, "but I'm going to need some help." His words were simple, but I could hear the vulnerability in his voice, a side of him I hadn't seen before. He needed me now more than ever, and that only made my feelings more complicated. Jake was still living with us, and now, with Ryan home, the tension in the house was unbearable. Every time Jake entered the room, I found myself avoiding his eyes, desperately trying not to think about what had happened between us. But I could see that Ryan suspected nothing. He was so focused on his recovery that he didn't notice the storm raging inside me. Every evening, I helped Ryan change, tending to his injured shoulder, and each touch was a reminder of my betrayal. I felt like a traitor, now forced to care for the man I had wronged, and the weight of it crushed me. I wanted to scream, to confess everything to him, but I was terrified that it would break him even more. Jake, on the other hand, stayed quiet. He was still around, but his presence had become an unbearable reminder of what I had done. Every time our eyes met, the guilt inside me only deepened. We both knew the situation had spiraled out of control, but neither of us had the courage to do anything about it. I knew that sooner or later the truth would come out. It was getting harder and harder to hide everything from Ryan, and the tension in the house grew with each passing day. I tried to stay by Ryan's side, helping him with his recovery, but the guilt was gnawing away at me constantly. I lived in fear that something small would expose everything about Jake and me, but I never expected it to happen so suddenly. One evening, Ryan decided to rest in our bedroom. I didn't think much of it until I heard him shout my name, his voice filled with a mix of anger and pain. When I rushed into the room, I saw Ryan standing by the bed, his face twisted with fury. In his hand was a box of contraceptives. I froze, realizing in that moment how badly things had spiraled out of control. "What is this?" he growled, his voice thick with rage. He waved the box in the air before bending down and pulling out a pair of Jake's underwear from beneath the bed. The room fell deathly silent, the air seeming to freeze around us. My heart stopped, and it felt like the world was crumbling around me. I couldn't find the words. All I could do was stand there and watch as fury and betrayal flashed in Ryan's eyes. In that moment, I knew he had pieced everything together. His gaze shot to the door just as Jake walked into the room. "Is this yours?" Ryan hissed, holding up the underwear in one hand and the box in the other. Jake remained silent, his face pale, knowing there was no way out. Before I could say anything, Ryan lunged at Jake. Their fight was brutal, fueled by the fury that had been building inside Ryan for so long. He attacked, completely forgetting about his injured shoulder, striking with a force that seemed to embody all the pain he was feeling. Jake tried to defend himself but didn't fight back, knowing that hurting Ryan would only make things worse. I screamed, begging them to stop, but they were both consumed by their anger. At one point, Ryan, blinded by rage, threw another punch and re-injured his shoulder. He cried out in pain, but his anger still pushed him forward. Finally, I threw myself between them, desperate to end the nightmare. Jake was the first to step back. He realized that the fight had only made everything worse, that it had destroyed what little was left. Without saying a word, he left the room and then the house. In his eyes, I saw the pain, the guilt, and the understanding that there was no going back. I was left alone with Ryan, who was hunched over in pain, staring at me with a mix of hatred and betrayal. In that moment, I knew that everything we had built had been shattered. It had been a few weeks since Jake had left our home after that terrible fight with Ryan. Our lives were in pieces. Ryan barely spoke to me, his anger and disappointment hanging heavily in the air. He was still recovering from his injury, and I continued to help him. But every time our eyes met, all I could see was the hurt. One morning, I started feeling unusually dizzy and weak. I thought it was just stress. After all, too much had happened recently. But when the symptoms didn't go away and only seemed to worsen, I began to worry. I went to the pharmacy and bought a pregnancy test, not fully understanding why I was doing it. When the two lines appeared on the test, my world shattered. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart pounded so loudly, it felt like it echoed through the entire room. It was a shock. I was pregnant, but the most devastating realization was knowing whose child it was. This was Jake's child. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and despair. I couldn't keep this baby. Its very existence would be a constant reminder of everything I had done wrong, of all the pain I had caused Ryan. How could I live with that kind of lie? Every time I would look at the child, I wouldn't just see an innocent life. I would see the embodiment of my betrayal. Those days were the most agonizing of my life. I was lost, not knowing what to do. Abortion seemed like the only option, but even making that decision felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I thought long and hard, desperately trying to find another way, but I couldn't. This baby couldn't come into the world. I couldn't live with that burden. I made an appointment at the clinic. When the day arrived, I was in such an emotional haze that I barely remember how I ended up in the doctor's office. Everything felt distant, as if it were happening to someone else. I heard the doctors talking, giving instructions, but inside, all I felt was emptiness. When it was over, I sat in silence, realizing that I had returned to my desolate reality. On the surface, it seemed like the right decision. I did it for my family, for what was left of my life, but inside, I felt like I had lost a part of myself. This pregnancy could have destroyed everything I had left, and I couldn't allow that. But the abortion didn't bring me peace. I felt like I had lost control over my life, and now I was left in a void with no way forward, no way back. After the abortion, I felt hollow, as if there was nothing left inside me. I had made the only decision that seemed right, but the guilt consumed me entirely. I realized that everything that had happened over the past few months had not only destroyed my life, but had also wreaked havoc on the lives of those around me. Ryan and I continued living together, but only because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed in this marriage not out of love or attachment, but because I saw no other option. Ryan knew this, he could sense it, and this reality only pushed us further apart. Every day I woke up feeling trapped with no escape. Our marriage had long since broken, yet we remained under the same roof like two strangers. I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but everything was different. I felt trapped in a world of my own pain and regret. Ryan, though he tried to be there for me, had become a stranger. We spoke less and less, and even when I looked at him, all I could see was the reflection of the pain I had caused him. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night from anxious dreams, haunted by everything that had happened. I thought about Jake, about how we had destroyed our family. I was ashamed even in front of myself. My choices had led to the point where I couldn't even look Ryan in the eye anymore. Every movement he made, every word he spoke was a reminder of what I had done. I tried to repair our relationship, to be there for him, to support him in his recovery, but the harder I tried, the wider the gap between us seemed to grow. I could no longer hide my guilt and the turmoil inside me. Ryan tried to carry on, as if nothing had changed, but I knew he sensed the difference in me. He saw how much I had changed, but he couldn't understand the depth of my pain. One evening, as we sat together at the dinner table, the silence between us thick and suffocating, Ryan suddenly looked up, his eyes serious and filled with tension. "You're not the same as you were before," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that I couldn't ignore. "I don't know what's happened to you, but I can feel that something between us is broken." I couldn't find the words to respond. His statement cut through me because I knew he was right. Something had indeed broken, and I didn't know how to mend it. The guilt I carried had grown so overwhelming that I could no longer hide the turmoil inside, but telling him the truth would mean shattering everything beyond repair. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. My relationship with Ryan had been destroyed to the point where the lie I was living was consuming me entirely. I could no longer look him in the eye, knowing what I was hiding. We shared the same apartment, but the distance between us had never been greater. And though I dreaded the consequences, I knew it was time to come clean. One evening, I summoned all the courage I had left. We were sitting at dinner, and I realized I couldn't delay it any longer. My hands trembled, and my heart raced in my chest. I looked up and spoke softly. Ryan, we need to talk. He looked at me with a mix of confusion and resignation, but there was something in his eyes that told me he had been anticipating this moment for a while. What is it? He asked, his voice steady, though I could hear the edge of worry creeping in. I took a deep breath and began to speak, barely able to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. I have to tell you the truth about what happened, about the baby. I watched as shock and disbelief flickered across his face. Baby? He repeated, as if the word was foreign and unfamiliar to him. Yes, I was pregnant, I continued, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to keep from breaking down. And the baby wasn't yours. His face twisted as if I had struck him with the deepest blow. He stared at me, trying to process the words he had just heard. It was Jake's, I barely managed to say, and the silence that followed was unbearable. I had an abortion because I knew I couldn't keep that baby. I couldn't live with it. Ryan slowly rose from his chair, his eyes filled with rage and pain, as if he were battling a storm within. You're telling me that the baby was your brother's? He shouted, his voice reverberating through the room. I nodded, unable to say anything more. I had expected his anger, but hearing it out loud made the weight of my actions feel even heavier. Ryan stood there, his breathing labored, and I saw his fists clench. How could you? How could you do this? He yelled, his voice full of pain, betrayal, and fury. You've destroyed us, our family, everything. He turned to me sharply, his eyes blazing with anger. I can't live like this anymore. I can't trust you. We need a divorce. Those words sliced through me like a knife. I knew it was inevitable, but hearing it still felt like a blow I wasn't ready for. I tried to say something, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. All I felt was emptiness. Despite all the pain and fear, there was a strange sense of relief that washed over me. Everything was out in the open now, and I was no longer living a lie. I couldn't undo what I had done, but at least there was no more hiding behind the walls of secrecy. Ryan walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. Everything had been shattered, but at least now I was being honest with him and, perhaps for the first time, with myself. After Ryan filed for divorce, my life changed irrevocably. I was left alone in the apartment, where every corner echoed with memories of what I had lost. No one could help me cope with the pain, not Ryan, who was now gone from my life, nor Jake, whom I hadn't seen since he walked away. I had lost them both, and with that came the crushing realization that my life had fallen to pieces. The days following the divorce were some of the hardest I had ever faced. Each morning, I woke up with a profound sense of emptiness, and each night I went to bed knowing there was no way to turn back the clock. My mistakes had led me here, and now I had to live with the consequences. I didn't know where to begin. I had to start over from scratch. But an inner voice kept reminding me of everything I had destroyed, the family I had torn apart, the love I had betrayed. I searched desperately for peace, but instead, I found only bitterness and regret. It often felt like this weight would forever anchor me to the past, preventing me from moving forward. But gradually, I began to understand that life goes on, even when it feels like everything has fallen apart. I started to search for ways to heal. I spent countless hours reflecting on my mistakes, on how I had allowed my desires to dismantle everything I once held dear. I tried to learn how to forgive myself, though it was far more difficult than I had ever imagined. Each step felt like an uphill battle, but I knew I had to keep moving. My days became filled with small victories, a simple walk through the city, the attempt to discover new hobbies, even the consideration of starting therapy. In these small steps, I began to catch glimpses of hope, a faint promise that perhaps one day I could find peace. Perhaps one day I could start to forgive myself. But the answer to the bigger question, whether I could rebuild my life and find meaning again, remained uncertain. I didn't know what the future held. Could I find a path to forgiveness? Could I regain control of my life, or would the past continue to haunt me forever? Those questions remained unanswered, but one thing I knew for sure: life goes on, and I had a chance to start over with a blank slate.